So it's 50 years after the March on Washington, and I'm struck by the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. would not have been invited to speak at his own commemoration. Do you realize that? Why? Because President Obama would never have been able to stand on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with Dr. King, because Dr. King would have publicly and eloquently eviscerated the president's decision to use military force in Syria at this time. Now, since Dr. King's not here, I'll do my best to lift up what I think he would have said to this country, to our president at this time. Now, first, let me say that one of the reasons that religious freedom is essential to a democracy is because in a democracy, religious leaders and religious communities have a role to serve as the conscience of the democracy. Right now, our president and our military leaders and our Congress are debating bombing Syria for what they're claiming is necessary for our national security. In other words, they are contemplating an attack that will inevitably kill and displace civilians, including women and children. And these civilians who die and who have to flee their homes, there in the desert of Syria, will die in your name and in my name, presumably for our safety and security. Now, at this point, we've given the Assad regime plenty of time to move their strategic targets into heavily civilian-populated areas, which we understand he's doing. Once we unleash our bombs, in the eyes of the world around, America, many in the world around, America will be no better than Assad, just another killer of innocents. And yet, it is also true that we have a regime in Syria that is apparently willing to gas its own people to death, including children, and have already killed 100,000 others using conventional weapons and have displaced an astronomical 2 million of its own people who fled to safety. So we as Americans and as citizens of the world have to also explore the morality of inaction. Inaction in the face of such devastation and carnage is also a moral question that warrants being answered, not only by our press and our pundits and our politicians, but by our religious leaders and communities. So this morning I come in the tradition of the American preacher as a prophetic voice in our democracy to lay out the moral issues and the criteria for action or inaction in the Syria crisis. Not the message I had planned for homecoming, but I didn't think that our president was going to tell us that he wanted to bomb another country in the Middle East either. Now, I did the same before we bombed Afghanistan and Iraq. And in both of those cases, I made it clear that I'm not a pacifist, but that I have studied enough about the ethics of war to explain that neither of those military campaigns were morally justified. And I laid out the reasons why in my sermon and also suggested some alternatives. Nevertheless, despite my prophetic voice, we went into those wars. The conscience rarely wins out in these situations, in part because the motivation for American aggression is rarely morality. I can remember after the sermon that I gave about Afghanistan, I was bicycling around the neighborhood and the next day, and a member of the church spotted me, and he was very angry, as all of us were after the bombings of September 11th, 2001, and he said, "I completely disagree with your sermon, and I think we should bomb the Afghanis back into the Stone Age." And I said, "You know, my friend, you are very welcome to your opinion. That's one of the great things about this church, is that we have the freedom of the pulpit and the freedom of the pews." I said, "Just remember, though, that you didn't get that opinion from your church." And I say the same this morning. You pay me to distill the values of this church and the tradition from which it comes through the fire of my understanding, my experience, my education, and my moral integrity on the most important issues of the day, to offer a religious perspective And what makes the free church particularly valuable and uncompromised is that our ministers are not beholden to any pope or pontifical powers, not to any doctrine or dogma or creed or adjudicatory. I stand upon the tradition of the American free pulpit this morning to speak truth to power and to be unimpeded in the exposition of the moral criteria for a moral life. And you are fully free and therefore fully responsible to determine for yourself whether you agree or disagree. Your moral actions and your moral decisions are yours to decide and to defend. Here's what I have to say. What's at stake? As one analyst put it this week, on the one hand, we cannot simply launch missiles into this region that kills innocent civilians, which they will, and then go eat a burrito and talk about our fantasy football teams. On the other hand, we can't simply stand idle as civilians are gassed by their own government and as tens of thousands of civilians are killed by a regime that devalues life. So what is right and appropriate to do? I hope you're wrestling with this question as much as I am and have been this past week. Now, in a situation like this, there may not be a right and appropriate response. It may be that the best we can do is choose between the lesser of two unfortunate responses. Nevertheless, a moral cause requires a moral response. There's no question that trying to stop the use of biological weapons on innocent people is a moral cause. The question before us is a military strike a moral response? One thing that what military law tells us and international law tells us is that using force without international sanction violates international law unless the action is in self-defense. In other words, we will be breaking international law in an effort to uphold the rule of international law. And it belies common sense to suppose that flouting international law in this situation makes our nation and world safer. But even Dr. King would say that sometimes one has to break a law on moral grounds in order to serve a greater good. So let's look at the issue of whether there are adequate moral grounds upon which we can launch military strikes in Syria. In the theological discipline, which I have studied, there is something called just war theory, which was first developed by theologians Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine. Just war theory articulates both when war is justified and how to conduct a war. And the first principle of a just war is that it's a just cause. We've already established that the gassing of people, the breaking of international treaties is a just cause. However, even if we agree that it's a just cause, in order to comply with just war theory, it would also have to have a high probability of success. And in Syria right now, it seems very nebulous whether anyone knows what success would look like. We're not sure that we could stop Assad's capacity to use chemical weapons. You can't just bomb chemical weapons factories without sending chemical weapons and killing hundreds of thousands potentially of people. But even if we did stop his ability to use chemical weapons, if he keeps killing civilians by the 5,000 a week, as he's been doing for the last couple of years, sending 5,000 a day, fleeing from their homes with just whatever they could carry on their backs into the desert, into the unknown, not knowing where they're going, where they're going to sleep, what's going to happen for the rest of their lives. Imagine what it would take to leave your home into that abyss through the desert, 5,000 a day. Let's be honest, we have not been very successful in our efforts in that part of the world over the past 3 decades. Let's just look at the record. Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya. Our interventions in these countries have not made the region more democratic. They have not made those countries more safe. And they have not made the United States more respected in the region or around the world. So I'm not sure what the objectives are for success here. We need to realize that our military approach to that whole region of the world is fundamentally misguided and chronically ineffective. Now, the final criteria of a just war is that military aggression has to be the last resort, having exhausted all peaceful means of meeting the objectives. Now, we have not even come close to having exhausted all of the diplomatic and humanitarian means of achieving the goal of holding Assad accountable. Now, therefore, from the standpoint of just war theory, an attack on Syria at this time does not qualify as a just war. Breaks international law, breaks the law of just war or moral theory. Some will argue that we are not proposing a war, we're just proposing limited strikes. But let's be serious. Bombing a sovereign nation is an act of war. If anybody bombed our country, we would consider that an act of war. As Kathleen Parker has said, waging a little bit of war is like being a little bit pregnant. We have to be prepared. If we're going to do this, once we enter the fray militarily, we don't know what will happen. And certain responses will require us to go deeper. Like if they use chemical weapons after we've done this limited strike, we'll be obliged to respond again. We have to respond again at that point for our own credibility and for the credibility of the international standards. Or if the Assad regime decides to start shelling our allies, such as Israel, or if Iran or others get drawn into the conflict, which could very easily happen with 2 million refugees already in those countries, Jordan, Iran. People are running to Iraq for safety. Think about that. Turkey, they're already not very stable. It's not a very stable region of the world, and now we have refugees by the hundreds of thousands entering into these countries, destabilizing those nations even further. If we bomb, the likelihood of more people having to flee or deciding to flee is very high. Now, let me be clear. This is not a question of if we should respond to the crisis in Syria. The question is how. How to best respond in a way that is both morally defensible and effective. Effective being pretty important. Now, in the Bible, we have some teachings about this. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, if hit on the right cheek, turn the other cheek so that it will be hit as well. Now, this is not, as many people think, a prescription for pacifism. Saying if somebody hits you, just, take it on the chin. That's not what Jesus was talking about. To punch someone on the right cheek, now think about this. You have to use your left hand to punch them. Most people in that time, in that part of the world, you don't use your left hand to punch. What he was talking about was a backhanded slap. That's how you hit the right cheek of somebody. And that was very common in that era, that part of the world, and it's a rebuke from a superior to an inferior. It's an insult and a rebuke. And so what Jesus was saying was, when that happens to you, turn your left cheek to force them to punch you. Because in that culture, when you punch somebody, now you only punch an equal. Force them to treat you like an equal. That's what he was saying. He wasn't saying just roll over. There's another line in this. This is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, where he says that if you get conscripted to take someone's pack for a mile, go a second mile. And people say, well, gosh, this isn't, let me just tell you, this is not about generosity. It was legal in the Roman Empire to conscript any citizen to carry a military person's pack for a mile. But it was illegal to make them carry it more than a mile. So when you keep going after that mile, now you're putting that person in jeopardy of being arrested. They're going to have to wrestle their pack back from you in order to hopefully keep themselves out of danger. Jesus was giving ways of responding and changing the culture, shifting the power that were both not violent, but also very effective and creative. The last one is one of my favorites. So he says, if they take your coat, give them your cloak as well. Again, this is not an act of generosity that he was presupposing. What Jesus was saying was, in that time, especially if you were poor, that's all you had was a coat and a cloak. So after they took your coat, you say, well, take my cloak too. You're standing naked out there on the street. And in that culture, it is shame upon the people who see someone else's nakedness. So you're standing out there and those people are shamed. You are exposing their unjust use of power, taking your stuff. This is what this was about. Jesus was a radical person who was talking to people about how to use power well, how to use it creatively, even non-violently, to change the world. Martin Luther King got it. He wasn't going to take on America violently. He took on America using this advice very strategically, non-violently, and exposed where the real evil was. Mahatma Gandhi wasn't going to take on the British Empire violently. He was going to lose. He took it on non-violent. He understood this. He read the Sermon on the Mount and wrote extensively about it. So that's what we're talking about here. Again, my point is, today, even as I raise serious questions about the morality and the efficacy of a military strike on Syria, I am not at all advocating that we do nothing in response to Assad. I believe this is a moral cause, and it does require, however, a more imaginative moral response. That's how I feel, too, about this. As Jim Wallace of the Sojourner magazine has said, the complications of the Syrian situation must not lead to a passive response, but to a more creative one. We need to create a unified international strategy to hold Assad accountable, morally accountable for his actions. Assad's use of chemical weapons could be leveraged, think about this, to open up international cooperation even with Syrian allies. Because even his allies, Iran and Russia, strongly disapprove of chemical weapons. Iran suffered them in their war with Iraq and have made a big deal about it. If we have enough evidence, as President Obama tells us we do, and if we have time, which President Obama has assured us we do, then let's take it to the United Nations and show the world our evidence. We've got the compelling evidence. We've got the time. Let's do that instead of breaking international law. And then, at the very least, we have the chance of getting Iran and Russia to at least agree to some kind of a response, because they've clearly broken international law. And at the very worst, we can shame Russia and Iran to say, no, we're not going to respond, and show their duplicity to the world. Now, getting the world on our side, if we want to restore American credibility around the world, let's try that instead of bombing Syria because of some talk of a red line. We have to find a way to punish Assad without further punishing his people, his neighbors, the stability of the region, and the security of the rest of the world. In other words, we must hold Assad accountable, pressure the world to join us to protect the vulnerable, and ultimately find a political solution. Besides making the case to the United Nations, there's so many other things that we can consider. I mean, Thomas Friedman talks about a no-fly zone, sanctions. We could spend billions of dollars that we would spend bombing, trying to help the humanitarian efforts of these millions who fled to get the respect of the world, including probably many around the Middle East who would say, look at the Americans trying to help this situation that Assad is creating. Again, like Jesus, exposing where the evil is and where power is being misused instead of just being goaded into using our own power in a way that then makes us look like we're the bad guys. So, what am I saying? Jesus says care for the least of these in society. Part of the rationale we hear is that we want to help the people of Syria. I don't think bombing them is the way to help them. If Assad eventually loses power, which he's likely to do, we can bring him for crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court and hold him accountable in that way. It's not the only way to hold him accountable is to go on some misguided military adventure to go bomb strategic sites around that we don't know what the repercussions will be. The fact is we haven't even begun to exhaust our diplomatic, economic, or humanitarian options. Now, our theme this month is vision, and I hope that in some of this I've offered some moral clarity, some vision of other ways that we could respond than the ways that our leaders are suggesting that we respond. It is said that if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We in the United States have an outstanding military. Probably the best the world has ever seen. Not that it's helped us be very effective around the world, but we have one. And it is such an enormous part of our economy, such an enormous part of our national identity, that once again we have moved too quickly to think, to move to military actions instead of looking at other solutions. Now, I hope you'll join me this week in asking our government officials here in Oklahoma, who are going to be voting in the Senate and the Congress, to think of more creative and morally justified means to hold the Assad regime accountable than the idea that's being put forth by the administration. To open up the possibility of another bloody and expansive war against an unstable Middle Eastern country, and in this case one backed by Russia and Iran, is something that we should try to avoid at all costs. If indeed it was Assad who ordered the chemical weapons, which seems to be pretty clear, then it was an act of desperation on his part, and bombing him and his officials are only going to make him more desperate. And what we know is that desperate people who are in jeopardy of losing their power do horrendous things. And that's what we're already seeing, and we're just going to see more of it. Think about it. In Egypt, just in the last couple of months, they killed 1,500 of their own citizens, the military, because they were concerned they were going to lose power. In Israel, 2009, they bombed Gaza, killed 1,500 citizens, including 400 children, because they were afraid that their sovereignty was in jeopardy. We see this all the time. It's only going to be worse over there where we've already seen such atrocities. So just like the gentleman from our church after my sermon about Afghanistan in 2001, you might still think bombing Syria now is the right thing to do and the right action to take. That's yours to decide. We can agree to disagree, but remember, you did not get that opinion from me or this church. Here we teach turning the other cheek, not as some passive response to injustice, but as a way of being morally persuasive and effective in countering injustice. And so with that prophetic, some will say polemical message, we kick off a new year here at All Souls. In the words of Wayne Arneson, the way is often hard, and the path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Welcome back. It's going to be an interesting year.